So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm really excited. I'm going to try to frame energy transition as a component or within this holistic process of climate adaptation in cities. And one of the things I want to start with is essentially my focus. And my focus is from the transformative design for climate adaptation, public health, energy reliability, ecosystem restoration, planning sustainable communities, and focusing on the future. Most of my work comes from practice. I joined UH 4 years ago, and I'm researching the process of climate adaptation implementation and what it takes to implement these kind of large, complex projects that are going across urban systems. But my interest in this lies and kind of the origin is from working in practice for many years for a company from a Dutch company based in New York. And shout out to Arcadis, which was our partner in many projects on various climate adaptation projects in the Northeast in the US and in other places, trying to think about the comprehensive efforts of what does it mean to address severe weather and how we adapt and work together to kind of improve the urban realm. And of course, the main focus of the issue is often the communities. All of these projects are ingrained and are core within their geographies. Community members are the experts on the subject and are the focus point and on what they need and how we can kind of produce co-benefits with any kind of ideas that we're trying to design to withstand and sustain kind of severe weather events, but then at the same time, how we can provide for them a better urban environment. And as designers, which is my perspective as an urban designer and a planner, our goal is to offer multiple pathways. We start with a comprehensive design vision that might be a very long-term idea that we would like to achieve. But then at the same time, we try to provide multiple scenarios that will respond to near-term solutions and to long-term solutions. And my approach within the system is often kind of multi-layered. I call this kind of stratigraphy as a geological sense. When we're looking at the context, so we're looking at the watershed, the hydrology, the landscape, understanding the historic transformation of landscape, the sediment motion, hydrology. At the same time, we need to examine the sectional processes. So urban systems, urban infrastructure, utilities, where water ends up within the city, and then how it works and how it correlates with all of the other infrastructure systems. And then governance and policies that allows us to implement some of these projects, potentially pays it, but it's also creates some disinvestments or some limitations in what can be done and some historic challenges for certain communities. And as I mentioned before, communities at the core of it. We're improving the urban environment and trying to focus on the urban environment for the public and for the people that live there. When we're trying to understand these systems and their juxtaposition, the links are crucial for implementation, and the risk can be compounding. So it's often this layered condition when we're trying to think about everything together at once, but also separate. So thinking about the impacts of groundwater, rainfall, droughts, tree condition, heat stress, and in other locations, it can be kind of a different selection of layers. What's interesting is that McKinsey Global Institute released this December a report about advancing adaptation. And I'm going to nerd out a little bit about this report because, one, as someone who focuses on adaptation, I feel seen. And I feel it's interesting that consultancy like McKinsey is starting to talk about the risks, but also the financial implications of adaptation and maladaptation. So when we're thinking about adaptation, we go back to the IPCC kind of original framing of what is adaptation, looking at the geography, exposure, level of hazard, social vulnerability. Much focused on this kind of events-based framing, risk reduction through technical fixes, engineering. In recent years, they evolved their definition to something that seems incredibly complex to try to understand everything that goes into this kind of like multi-layered. So the natural environment, the sectoral changes, utilities, water, power, housing policy, local governance, responsibility, everything. Um, but what the last IPCC identifies, and also the McKinsey Global Institute, is that adaptation stays in the back. So far, it's treated as reactive, and it's not um, it's not implemented enough based on the ROI that we might expect from something like that. And why is that, and what can we kind of start working on in order to improve that in a way? Oops, sorry. So one of the things I started understanding from literature from Professor Jesse Keenan from Tulane, who looks at adaptation from the real estate perspective, and Professor Sarah Miro from ASU, who studies kind of also cross implementation, is that there are specific issues within the sphere of adaptation as a structural transformation. One, that it should be viewed and addressed as a process. So it's not necessarily an implementation of an action as a response to a critical event. So it's not just the recovery and the result that we need to do after, but there's also the sociopolitical mechanism. So the institutions and the human drivers for decision making, who holds power and what are the markets prescribing for us to do, how things shift within the environment based on kind of different public interests. And then the spatial and systemic framework, which is kind of my personal interest and focus within this as a designer, is what is the complex web of interconnected systems that are spanning different physical and administrative scales? We're talking about the large watershed scale, but also the neighborhood scale, how we can kind of move and think about solutions within those two different multi-scalar systems and networks. And finally, economy. And it's something that's pointed out in the MGI report, is that there is a resiliency gap. There is an uneven distribution of costs and capacity that can manage and implement some of these projects. There are ideas for projects, but projects are not funded or are having difficulty to find funding. And the kind of intersections in the system is the governance. So different jurisdictions, different issues with coordination, different policies that might need to change. And they're all kind of on this temporal scale of implementation, how long it might take to change a specific policy versus how long it might take to define who's regulating and who's managing the specific aspect of the implementation of a project. And then the limits and scale of geography are these considerations when we're thinking about the cost of adaptation on a dense urban environment as New York versus a rural area that is more sparse and requires different scales of interventions. And at the same time, how does this being broken down between kind of equity issues of privatized investment in specific properties versus investment in larger scale options? My approach to this is somewhere in between. So it's kind of looking at the spatial governance of adaptation and thinking about it. If we're thinking about the governance for implementation, understanding different systems, trying to understand the institutional capacity, whether it's of an organization or a community, and then operation and maintenance, which is often doesn't talked about enough, but is kind of where adaptation might fail. It's the main cost of many of these projects. It's MGI estimates it to be 60% of most of the cost compared to the capital in projects cost. And it's the long-term thinking about who's going to implement this, who's going to manage it, who are the people that are going to make this infrastructure adaptable and sustainable for a long term. And when we're thinking about this spatial decision making, that's the link between where water comes in, water across all systems. So from potable drinking water, surface water, storm water, energy, and then the land use that prescribes it. And adaptation fails where scale, maintenance, and governance are misaligned, and energy reliability makes that misalignment visible sometimes. Oops. So one example, again, when I'm trying to kind of think about what does it mean when we're talking about operation is training workforce. So this is an example for one of the projects we worked at one and also collaborated with Arcadis on the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project that was recently, kind of sections of it were open this summer after Hurricane Sandy, after 10 years. And one of the things we see is that whenever you have these massive systems, you need to have a workforce that can come and deploy them. You need someone to maintain them along the time. And then at the same time, when we're thinking about an event or planning for an event of a storm or a hurricane, it's operational and kind of economic limits and economic damage to the system of people deploying this and blocking part of the waterfront or a specific area. Oops. So the MGI report makes kind of a very interesting evaluation. It thinks the operational challenge globally is $1.2 trillion is needed annually for adaptation when we're thinking about the 2 degree scenario. And the split is between 60% for operational cost and 40% for capital expenditure. And it also connects us to this energy question where the main challenge is heat. It's kind of extreme heat and how it works its way in our cities. So roughly 70% of heat protection costs are going on operations because they're reliant on energy use. And it's going to our needs to go and find an air-conditioned space. Excuse me. So essentially, the question kind of is still lingering of what makes adaptations so complicated and what projects could be done and what's been happening so far. And that's what I want to kind of talk about a little bit today. And thinking about, even though we significantly underinvest in adapting, there are these ROI projections of $1 in adaptation can be $3 to $7 in damages that are avoided. But when we really dive deep into how these projects are done, we can start seeing why is it so difficult. So I'll walk through kind of 3 case studies, risks, anecdotes, and hopefully it depends on how fast I'll talk. So one, I'll kind of walk through extreme heat. I worked on a research project with a colleague in Phoenix, but I'll cover some of the research that we've done based on resiliency hubs and the challenges of extreme heat. And then on some of the projects we did in practice, which is interesting to see because these are projects that started 5 years ago and 10 years ago. And it's interesting to see how they're progressing and are evolving. So extreme heat as a threat multiplier. So this paper by Mora et al. That was published in Nature Cities on global risks of deadly heat mentions that 30% today of the world's population is already exposed to deadly heat conditions for at least 20 days per year. And exposure to heat stress is different because it impacts the body, it impacts on the long term, and it has kind of a clearer impact on vulnerable populations, medically and spatially, let's say. And it's kind of hard to see in a way when we're talking about flooding. We know this has happened and the house flooded, but heat is slower. Um, and it's something that's kind of now is being discussed within the adaptation community and within the kind of different planning strategies across municipalities and addressed in different ways, which I'll try to cover a little bit. So our work looked at Phoenix and the Phoenix metro area, the Valley of the Sun, in 2023 had 54 days with temperature of at least 110 Fahrenheit. And it broke the record of 53 days set in 2020. The number of deaths, the county's Department of Public Health that associated with heat in 2023 was 645, and 67% of them were outdoors deaths. At the same time, when we're kind of starting to look at the details, out of every two victims, they had a history of physical or medical condition. And heat is a challenging adaptation issue, but it's also impacts directly the body and directly people who are the elderly or have any kind of medical preconditions, regardless of where they are located. And six of these deaths happened at the bus stop. And this is where we kind of start talking about the design of our public realm and the design of the space where people have to spend time outside during the extreme heat waves and how the urban environment looks. An interesting study from Arizona, University of Arizona in Tucson actually looked at buses. And one of the interesting conclusions it had that the buses, and it's kind of a silly anecdote, the buses were imported from a European country that is not adjusted to heat. And in order to address the impact and the heat in Tucson, they had to add additional cooling systems to those buses, making them very heavy, making it very hard to drive. And people continue to complain about the level of heat within those buses. So it's also kind of across the systems, from how the urban environment is designed to how we source our infrastructure elements. And when I'm talking about the most vulnerable, the people that are extremely vulnerable are people that have to spend time outside, regardless of if you potentially wait for the bus, if you have to stand outside and work. And Arizona Division of Occupational Safety had specific regulations to kind of require breaks and acclimatization practices and training and allowing people to drink water and have shaded or air-conditioned areas, but it still doesn't resolve the issue that there are people that sometimes have to be outside. And of course, we can see that in many cases, these are also people who are from low-income communities, communities of color, and vulnerable communities that are mostly impacted. Within the urban realm of the city, it's also interesting to see kind of the urban heat islands and spread of tree canopy and where it's accessible and where it's not, and where these vulnerabilities are consistent with other disinvestments or historical transformations within the urban environment. Our project looked at urban heat and resiliency hubs as an architectural feature, but also as an urban infrastructure. And we try to address this core issue that heat requires cooling as a solution. And cooling is air conditioned, but then air conditions creates stress over the power system and creates this paradox where there's a risk of failure within the system. And it comes to the critique of how we originally designed buildings or we designed our urban environment, whether it's houses that were marketed on their capacity to cool within mechanical systems, but also how we created these inward-looking spaces. An interesting take on kind of how a newcomer's guide to surviving the Phoenix summer looks at people recommending folks to either be in a cool space for the day or to leave the house only in the evening or early in the morning. And the reliance on air-conditioned systems is also heavy on this kind of risk of blackout and what potentially can happen when the energy system fails. Um, and one of the trajectories and one of the projections was that a 48-hour blackout during a heat wave could result in half of Phoenix residents needing emergency care and up to 13,000 deaths. A 2-day blackout can have almost 789 people needing 1,000 people needing emergency. Our colleague, so from an adaptation perspective, our colleague Melissa Gordar from ASU kind of created this breakdown of narratives and how people approach different um, heat risks. And it all comes at the end of it of the accessibility of energy and air conditioning. If you can afford air conditioning, if you can have easily access to reliable air conditioning, then heat is an inconvenience. If your grid is at risk of failing or your energy is too costly for you, heat is a manageable problem because perhaps you can go somewhere else. If you have to be outside, heat can be part of a narrative where it's a catastrophe. And she kind of built this problem definition of adaptive capacity. And one of the things we did in our study was trying to evaluate where within the Maricopa County heat relief network, where within this narratives most of the strategies fit in. And I'm not going to go into that, but most of the systems are relying on the idea of cooling centers, and cooling centers are often not a very desirable space. It's an emergency response. It's not a designed location for people to spend time at. And people will go there only if there's no choice. If we go back to the narratives, if heat is a catastrophe. And part of the challenge was kind of to understand, okay, so when are these spaces are designed and how they bring people together, but also how they respond to the multiple challenges of heat. So we visited various cooling centers, like this one in the Wellesley United Methodist Church, or this one in the First Christian Church, and kind of try to collect this understanding of the various strategies. And one of the things we realized that most of these places approach the heat as a catastrophe. So the people in the audience that usually visit these spaces are community members that have no choice. So these are the unhoused or folks who absolutely have to be there. And we wanted to see like what strategies and what solutions are offered that are within the middle, with between the heat is manageable, but also respond to other services. One of the things we looked at within the system was also mobile home parks. And the issue with mobile home parks is the kind of thermal security and the challenges, the ability of the physical house to cool itself and maintain cooling, but then also all of the policy and regulations within the system that perhaps allow people to apply for financing to pay for utility bills or for any kind of improvements or their homes, or any kind of limitations on what they can install that are guided by the owner of the lot. And at the same time, many of these homes are also located within the urban environment in areas that are more paved, more industrialized, and more closer to heat islands in areas of air pollution and urban heat, such as highways. So one of the things that the communities within those mobile homes started to do is that this Arizona State had the Right to Cool program, trying to allow and kind of prohibit park operators from restricting or disconnecting cooling systems for people, trying to allow financing for utility systems and try to kind of recognize thermal safety as a basic right in order to force park owners to address these issues for their communities. And part of the studies, and I'll run quickly, was kind of to look and start thinking about how we reorganize these mobile home parks, how we provide public spaces, how we try to think about the thermal comfort and cooling corridors, but also approach community land trusts and other ownership structures. One of the things that we looked at was also essentially resiliency hubs. And I'll only focus on energy-related resiliency hub for the sake of this conversation. So this is one of the wonderful examples within our city of Houston, and it's the West Street Recovery NAC hub houses. And this is Ms. Doris Brown in her hub house. So at least 10 units were constructed, supported by Solar Neighbors United. Essentially, at the block level, you have a community property with with PV and battery, allowing people to access power in events of a hurricane, events of a storm, or a failed grid, and providing different type of resources for their neighbors. This was a small initiative only by this community organization, and it's a very interesting way to think about grassroots resiliency hubs, but also grassroots microgrids and how they can expand. Of course, there are other examples across the nation on community centers that are starting to work as a resiliency hub, but also to provide power and energy, whether this community lighthouse project in New Orleans, who are looking at equipping 85 properties and many community spaces and social infrastructure as spaces for energy reliability. Churches are often the core of each community and are the most accessible places for people to go and seek refuge and seek support in the event of an emergency. And then an interesting case study from Sweden was focused on an issue of energy transition, where specifically their energy company was focused on decarbonization, and it had plans for increasing their solar capacity. And in order to do so, they had to coordinate with residents implementation of some of these solar panels and see how they can manage the limitation of the 500 kilowatt maximum per utility. And the utility company provided a community process of co-design, of starting to think about where they want to implement solar panels and where they want to kind of expand that network. And what the study found was essentially that what was most interesting for people was the kind of urban infrastructure that provided public space, but also had that co-benefit utility of providing energy to the neighborhood and to the community. So this was a participatory design, kind of in a way democratizing the decision-making about urban energy. Another example is kind of from Chelsea, Massachusetts, and it comes back to a project we started working on before COVID when it comes to their equity resiliency planning effort. So Chelsea is a majority minority community environmental justice town in Massachusetts with 40,000 residents. And one of the things they started working on is comprehensive and equitable resiliency planning in the last 5 years. And they've been working across multiple efforts. So one of the things they did with the community and university, with Boston University, was thinking about the cool block. So implementing a community initiative on one of the hottest identified blocks in the neighborhood and a socially vulnerable community, starting from tree planting, but then essentially evolving to designing a microgrid with the help of the city and Eversource. The microgrid and the solar panels are only located on publicly owned facilities and buildings, but are connected back to the system with the help and support of Eversource, their utility company. And then they also started recreating public spaces. So taking some of the areas that they have, kind of like having a contract with a property owner who has an vacant lot in order to create public space and in order to create gardens and provide them to the community and bringing the community into activating the space and creating it. And within this kind of multi-layered comprehensive, one of the efforts that we did with Chelsea was looking at green corridors within the system and kind of thinking through a ULI organized effort and kind of trying to plan areas for new development that will integrate green corridors. And it all kind of goes back to this equitable climate resiliency framework that try to think about where to meet people and kind of start from the locations of people's gatherings, so kind of building on churches as cores of the community and building on community action as the capacity to start implementing some of these efforts. So kind of within the heat landscape, and when we're thinking about implementing energy transition and energy strategies, I think most of the examples we started looking at are at the neighborhood scale, at the microgrid scale. It looks at climate adaptation as kind of something that is grassroots, but also kind of building upwards. There are other examples that are more top down, but the things that were successful are those that kind of congregates around the capacity of a specific social institution and can work in order to kind of, whether it's lower bills for community members or keep power during climate extremes or allow people to have access to energy when it's necessary. And this is kind of within this neighborhood scale. It's also interesting to see what can be done. So this is from the Houston Neighborhood Resiliency Plan we did with One Architecture and Urbanism several years ago. And again, the idea is kind of to build a catalog of options that can work and build capacity within the community, within the civic clubs, within the local super neighborhood leaders, and at the same time build capacity for funding and applying for grants and applying for small incremental projects. So for example, if we're thinking about the hub houses and how they were able to secure partnerships and governmental, federal, but also nonprofit funding, in a similar way, this can be a model for kind of small implementable strategies within communities. So again, I think I have a few more minutes, so I'll try to run quickly through another project. So when we're thinking about the scale, the idea of a watershed scale is interesting because it kind of asks us to think about what is the boundaries of the natural system versus the boundaries of governance and jurisdiction, and where municipal boundaries end versus where the risk and kind of our impact on the watershed system meets us. And one of the things with the community of Chelsea, we worked on with a community group called the Mystic River Watershed Association. And in Massachusetts, around 2016, and they still have the same program, they started the Municipal Vulnerability Protection Program that was based on providing each municipality funding for resiliency planning to identify the challenges and the risks and then start proposing actions. And now they're in the phase that most communities are applying for implementation grants, and they transformed it to the Mass Ready Act that has implementation grants. And what was interesting within the kind of framework of municipal governance in Massachusetts was how they incentivize specifically regional efforts and collaborations between municipal areas. So if you would work with your neighbor town and apply together to a grant because you both share the same reach point, you're eligible to a larger funding. And kind of it's a similar narrative across Houston and across the Northeast, is that areas that are reclaimed land and are built on wetlands are often prone to flooding. And in Chelsea, one of these areas that were most prone to flooding was the Island End River, and it's kind of shared between Chelsea on one side and Everett on the other, where in the when in the middle it's an extremely busy industrial site with the produce center that holds kind of all of the fresh produce for New England on the edge of that creek, and then various energy and oil storage facilities on the other. And we can also see this in historic documentation, especially understanding that this site was this site was also the site of the produce center was a tar factory and contaminated the soil. So when kind of in recent years, when they started preparing and testing the ground for the construction, they started understanding the level of contamination in the soil. And one of the things when we were working on this in 2019, was kind of mapping projections and the flood pathway for the flood maps, understanding specifically where the breach point is at every phase from 2030 and sea level rise projected for 2070, and seeing how the impact is between the municipal boundary of the two cities. And they'll have to work together in order to coordinate the implementation of this effort. And I'll skip that. So the next phase was essentially understanding if we want to kind of block this breach point, we will have to address several different policy limitations and kind of decide where we end and tie back this level of protection between the two municipalities, but also in order to not impact the industry and see how the industry can be still protected. And one of the things that we set aside as part of this project was kind of working on multiple pathways for implementation. So what does it mean if we build one phase by 2030? What does it mean if we have the second section of it by 2050? How we try to kind of be agile enough with different sections to rely on this kind of non-reliable stream of funding. What's interesting to see today is that this project that was evaluated for $120 million did receive a BRIC, well, it was awarded a BRIC funding for $50 million, which was canceled, unfortunately. But now it's kind of litigated, but they are still trying to implement it and trying to find other forms of funding for this project, or at least sections of it. Another example I want to kind of talk about when it comes to aggregated projects is more in downtown Boston. And I think I'll have to finish in that because I have probably 3 minutes. When we're looking at Boston, the scenario is very similar. We have the reclaimed land, and the reclaimed land is exactly similar to the flood pathway. And when we're thinking about adaptation and as a grand vision, for public benefit, for green spaces, for how we can improve our urban environment. One of the visions that the previous mayor of Boston, Marty Walsh, proposed in 2017 was this 47-mile-long band of green, which can be a lot of things, that kind of wraps around the city and protects it from coastal flooding. And I think the smart part of this project, and today it's interesting to see today they kind of start implementing, or at least designing for implementation of some of these projects, is how it breaks down into smaller projects. So it was broken down into districts. And when we're thinking about the downtown district, one of the things that we looked at similarly to all of the other projects was kind of the progress of flooding, the impact and of sea level rise on which areas are more vulnerable. But more importantly, when we're thinking about the comprehensive system that wraps around this peninsula and wharves, was understanding the ownership landscape. If we're thinking about paying, if we're thinking about kind of paying or like finding federal funding for like a federally accessible beautiful green projects, how will it work on private land? How do we kind of try and manage this conflict between privately owned land, publicly utilities, public access? And this was one of the questions that was kind of raised when we're thinking about the scale of these projects and why they start to aggregate. At the same time, we have utilities. We have everything underground. We have the big dig that was, let's say, recently constructed in infrastructure time. And we have tunnels. We have the soil under the wharves that was built in the 1600 with pilings that are basically kind of now part of the same mud that constructs the soil. And we have the community that has different interests. The people that live on the wharves want to be protected. The city potentially might have interest on the kind of easier solution on the public right of way. How do you negate that challenge between kind of the, let's say, the easy, it's never easy, but the simpler solution of building on public right of way versus the need to protect everyone and provide protection for private properties. And the other conflict of the site was also the city just regained access to its waterfront after the big dig was completed and the Rose Fitzgerald Greenway was constructed. So how do you kind of maintain that link? How do you not break that connection again? And one of the things we did as an exercise, and it's still within the kind of public report, is this under thinking about, okay, so if we have the wharves as a private property, how do we create scenarios of different levels of protection? How do we start with the roadway as an elevated system to protect everything behind it, providing perhaps utilities and connections to the wharves, but each building will have to protect themselves? How do we integrate a protective system that wraps around the structure, but also creates a public access? And then how we go to the kind of extreme in a way of like more space, more green space, more public space, but then also longer time frames because we have to work with the Army Corps in order to build into the water and build new land, the outboard solution. So one of the things that this started showing us is kind of the trade-offs that we can start thinking about when we potentially work with this aggregated scenario of trying to provide protection for different property owners, but then also protecting everything behind it. And I think it's also an interesting thing that is mentioned in the McKinsey report that kind of looks at, okay, so the cost of protecting the kind of people only in the floodplain versus the cost of protecting everything, and who bears that financial responsibility, but also who bears the maintenance and operation. Like if we have something that is managed by the city, does the city need to have like its own new entity to manage it? Is it managed by the state? Is it managed by the county? Who will be the institution to kind of take on themselves this responsibility? What's interesting to see, and that's for me, it's also an interesting reflection to see some of these projects, how they progress. So within the kind of resiliency tracker of early implementation in the city of Boston, one of the things they're showing now is that Long Wharf, which is a historic wharf, it's mainly publicly owned, it's Columbus Park, is starting kind of its design phases. And then the next phase is this kind of small gray line, and it's only shown on the road. So I wonder for myself, I haven't talked to anyone in the city, is if that means that they're kind of going for the road and public right-of-way solution, and then kind of allowing property owners to, in a way, defend themselves and kind of build their own protection. But it's just kind of an interesting way to read this map.